This is Voicemail, the Universal Postal Union's podcast covering the wonderful world of mail. I'm your host, Ian Kerr. In this episode, I'm talking with Gareth Phillips, Climate and Environment Finance Manager at the African Development Bank Group. And we're going to talk about a wide range of subjects, including climate mitigation, resilience, the gender-climate nexus, and how the post fits in with all this. So, coming up in just a moment, Gareth Phillips from the African Development Bank Group. Joining me on the line is Gareth Phillips. Gareth is Climate and Environment Finance Manager at the African Development Bank Group. Gareth, welcome to UPU Voicemail Podcast. The question that we ask all our guests is to share what your first memory of the post is.
Great. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to join you. So my first memory of the post is when I used to go and stay with my grandmother in Wales, and every morning the postman would stick his head through the door and shout, and she would shout back whether he had letters to deliver or not. And of course, as I later realized, he was providing a very important service in terms of supporting my grandmother, who was old and frail, and checking that she was all right. And actually, that story has particular resonance because she lived in a town called Fairborn in Cardigan Bay in Wales, and that area has now been given up to sea level rise. So actually, the house that we used to go and visit in is now frequently submerged by the sea. So it's particularly poignant given the topic of today's discussion.
Well, let's delve into a bit about what the African Development Bank Group does. So you've been there for a number of years now. Can you tell us a bit about what the bank's goals are and what its main work streams are?
So the bank's primary goal is to bring socioeconomic development to the African continent and to fight poverty. But increasingly, we've seen a greater focus on climate change and providing finance or financing projects that address the challenge of climate change. And so we currently have a goal that 40% of all of our investments need to be classed as climate finance. And indeed, following on from the COP and recent meetings with the IMF and so on, there's increased pressure on MDBs like the African Development Bank to do more work in the climate change space, because governments are realizing that if we don't deal with climate change, then hard-won development goals will start to be lost. All those improvements, the infrastructure and so on that have been put in place can literally get washed away if we don't take care of that. So we're working more and more now to address things like renewable energy, climate resilient agriculture and climate resilient infrastructure.
Well, then tell us a bit about what the current state of finance is for climate mitigation and resilience in Africa. And can you also share perhaps if there's something special about the region that's made you choose it as the major focus of your own work?
The current state of finance in Africa, Africa benefits very little in global terms from climate finance. In the region of 3.5% to 4% of total global finance comes to Africa. And we feel that that's a very small amount, given that Africa is home to 9 of the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change. Countries like DRC and Sierra Leone and Mali are particularly exposed and vulnerable to change. Of that 3.5%, it amounts to about $20 billion. The majority of that goes into mitigation activities, that's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is good. But Africa's main need is to adapt to climate change. We have in excess of 600 million farmers who rely on rain-fed agriculture, and therefore, as the climate change and rainfall becomes less reliable and more variable, then their incomes are at risk. We have 900 million people who don't have access to clean cooking technologies, and actually that number is growing because the population growth in Africa is faster than the rollout of clean cooking technologies. And you may ask, well, what's that got to do with climate change? But actually, clean cooking has a number of impacts. It uses up a huge amount, or if you can deploy clean cooking technologies, it frees up a huge amount of women and girls' time and enables them to be more productive. It helps the girls to go to school. The women can do more work in the fields and makes them more resilient to climate change, as well as, of course, helping to avoid the degradation of remaining forests and biomass in harvesting of fuel wood. So, and as to why we work in the region, I came to Africa 7.5 years ago to work for the African Development Bank because they were boosting their climate change program, and that's the field that I've been working in for most of my career. But when you look at the really sort of the whole kind of moral justice and the moral position, Africa is the country that is most in need of, or the continent that is most in need of support for climate change. And there's a tremendous amount of work to do here.
So then what can the postal sector do? I mean, the postal sector reaches out into every country around the world and across Africa. So what could it do? What's its role right now that could play, or the role that the postal sector could play in climate mitigation and even adaptation, I suppose?
Globally, we're looking for all institutions and organizations need to become Paris aligned. That's the phrase that we use to say that you adopt policies that will help you meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, which is to become ultimately net zero and to ensure that all your activities contribute to a low carbon and climate resilient future. So as an institution, like the African Development Bank, we would invite, the Postal Service to adopt a Paris alignment policy. And that means that you need to, first of all, look at your own internal activities, which would do things like transport, your office footprint, the energy you use, becoming more energy efficient, and ultimately moving to renewable energy. And of course, in Africa, there's a huge potential for example, rooftop solar panels and so on that can provide the energy that buildings and households need. Shifting to electric vehicles is more demanding. Obviously, there isn't the infrastructure present in Africa yet, but it will come. And in the meantime, we can look at more efficient fuel vehicles and better use of vehicles and so on. And then you can reach out to your staff or your employees to sensitize them and so on. But then, in terms of the services that you provide, I think this is also quite interesting. I mean, it depends, obviously reducing packaging, increasing recycling, but reducing the weight for airmail and things like that is already important, but maybe there's not too much scope around that. And then, I think the role, I think there is a role for the Postal Service, and it goes back to my opening statement about sort of the provision of social support and a social safety net. I think there is potentially a role for the Post to help raise awareness and act as an entity that builds awareness in rural populations about the need to transition to low carbon and climate resilient futures and the technologies that are available, particularly renewable energy. I think there's a fairly high level of awareness about roof-mounted solar panels and batteries and so on, but it always helps if there's more people talking about that. And then about climate resilient activities, insurance for agricultural producers, information systems on weather, and things like that. I don't know, but I sometimes think these are areas where the Post could get more involved.
Indeed, some of the technologies you've mentioned along the way there, things like solar panels on sorting centres, things like electric-powered vehicles are certainly being looked at in many parts of the world. Not universally, let's say, but from where you're sitting, what are some of the most promising green technologies that are out there that could simultaneously increase climate mitigation, the resilience and energy security, which is something we don't talk enough about, across the regions? And is there any of them that could be perhaps particularly relevant or suitable for the Post?
The biggest renewable energy technology, and I think the potential for Africa, is what we call green hydrogen, which is hydrogen that's generated from renewable energy. So it's effectively a net zero or a zero carbon emission fuel, but it's also a feedstock into hard to abate industrial sectors. So you can actually use it to replace natural gas in the manufacture of fertilizer, ammonia, chemical feedstocks, as well as for steel, cement and glass. But I don't imagine that the Post is going to get involved in green hydrogen production. But nonetheless, the rooftop solar or indeed ground-mounted solar, all of this kind of technology helps improve energy access and reduces the burden on existing grids, and will make it easier for utility companies to plan for and implement and invest in particularly sort of larger scale renewable energy technologies such as wind farms and geothermal, and in some instances hydropower or improving the quality of hydropower, and maybe pumped storage as a way of storing energy. And all of those technologies can contribute towards freeing up energy to go into the production of green hydrogen. So if everybody is able to do a little bit to support investment into renewable energy through, for example, rooftop solar, through clean cooking technologies, through electric vehicles and so on, then they can all help contribute to the bigger picture.
In the African region then, what do you consider to be more important? Is it emissions reduction, or is it building resilience to climate impact?
I think in the African region, in the majority of African countries, it's building resilience to the impacts of climate change. I mentioned the number of people that are at risk. We see that in the worst examples. There are already socioeconomic systems that are collapsing. Some agricultural systems are proving not to be sufficiently resilient. We see problems in the Sahel with particularly pastoralists. When they're herding cattle and they're arriving at places where they expect there to be grass and there isn't any grass. And they're eating the crops from the agronomists and so on. I mean, these are problems that we're already facing, and that results in the collapse of livelihoods, lack of activities particularly for youth, radicalization, marginalization, and ultimately migration. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg and the worst case scenario. But all over Africa, you see people are increasingly being pushed back towards poverty. People work hard to climb out of poverty, and then along comes a climate disaster. Of course, other disasters do the same thing, but climate disasters are happening more and more frequently now. So a flood or a drought typically then, forces them to consume what savings they have, and they're pushed back into poverty again because they haven't been able to build up enough resources to become resilient, or they don't have employment, they don't have insurance, and so on. So these are the sorts of adaptation and resilience issues. Of course, mitigation is important, and if we don't get on top of mitigation, then the problem will get worse. But Africa has a relatively small percentage. Historically, 3 to 4% of total emissions have come from Africa. And so even if African countries manage to reduce their emissions, it has a very small impact on the overall global emissions. Now, that's not to say that things aren't happening. In South Africa, there's a big program called the Just Energy Transition Plan, which is helping and planning to shut down all the coal-fired power plants in Africa over the next, 1 to 2 decades. And that will have a significant reduction on greenhouse gas emissions for the African continent. Similarly, there's a lot of work going on in Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco, and so on. And Senegal. These are some of the sort of the larger emitters. And we'll be continuing to invest in renewable energy to stop the greenhouse gas emissions growing in Africa. One area of concern for greenhouse gas emissions is methane. Methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas. It has a very rapid impact on the climate, and it doesn't have a very long life. So if you can stop emitting methane, then we could shave as much as 0.2 degrees off the global warming by 2050 if we can meet this 2030 target. But in Africa, one of the challenges is that as we urbanize, there will be more collection of solid and liquid waste. And if these are not treated correctly, they are a major source of methane. So if you have unmanaged landfills, as all that organic matter decomposes, it releases methane to the atmosphere. And there aren't very many managed landfills or sanitary landfills in Africa. They're expensive to build. And the likelihood is that a lot of waste will be just dumped. And the same with liquid waste. At the moment, most of it goes into open water where it decomposes aerobically. But if you start to collect it and process it, you produce methane. So these are technologies that we have to build in as we move forward and make sure that we don't make emissions worse in Africa as we develop.
Now, in your role at the African Development Bank, you also manage the Africa Climate Change Fund. So what kind of projects are you looking for, and what are, let's say, the key features of a successful application?
So the Africa Climate Change Fund is a multi-donor trust fund with about $33 million in it so far. And it offers grants, small grants, typically up to $1 million, to civil society organizations, governments and also to bank departments. So in other words, we can apply for those funds as well from within the bank. And we've recently revised it to also be able to offer grants to the private sector for non-profit making activities. And that's important because we expect the private sector to solve many of our problems. So I was keen that we should be able to support the private sector in these activities. And we also, now the focus of the Africa Climate Change Fund is on the Glasgow Climate Pact. Now, that was also significant because the Glasgow Climate Pact pulls in the Convention on Biodiversity and Desertification. It talks about reducing deforestation. It mentions the importance of the Global Methane Pledge in reducing emissions, as well as increasing investments into adaptation and mitigation. So basically, all things climate change can be supported through the Africa Climate Change Fund. It runs through what we call calls for proposals, which are released periodically. When we release a call for proposal, then anybody that's eligible is allowed to apply. The problem is we tend to get a lot of applications. Even the last one that we ran, even with a fairly tight front end to exclude people who are ineligible, we had over 400 applications, and we only had, I think, $7 or $8 million to support it, which means that we can do 10 to 15 projects out of that total amount. We're left with a pipeline of good projects, and we use that to try to raise more funding. There's always a need for more support. And the kinds of projects that we've done through that latest one, it was supporting gender. So, for example, we were supporting training and awareness raising amongst gender groups to participate in the climate change negotiation. We were supporting some women-led agricultural communities or cooperatives to help them gain access to training and technology. The next call for proposal that we have will focus on methane because we received some money from the US State Department to focus on methane. So we'll be looking for proposals, pre-feasibility studies, training, awareness raising, and possibly some actual projects on the ground to reduce methane emissions in Africa.
Now, in Western Europe, we've seen a couple of postal operators get involved in green bonds. So looking then in the African context, how can posts in Africa or even beyond secure climate finance and attract investment to improve the resilience, the sustainability of their own infrastructure? And where could this funding even come from?
So there are funds that would provide resources for those kinds of activities. The most likely would be the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, that is the sort of formal financing instrument under the Framework Convention for Climate Change. It is headquartered in Songdo in Korea. It is about to embark on its second replenishment. You access those funds through accredited entities. The African Development Bank is what we call an international accredited entity, so we can apply for funds to support projects across the continent, and we can apply for large amounts of money at high risk. But you also have what are called direct access entities, which are country-level entities that are accredited to access the funds. And for the post in a specific country, going through the direct access entity would be the most appropriate route. And you would need to come up with a project proposal that demonstrates how you're going to reduce your emissions, and also they're particularly interested in adaptation. So how you can ensure that your activities and the clients that you serve become more resilient to climate change. You can put that together into a proposal, and you can seek grants and concessional loans from the Green Climate Fund. So that would be one way that the Post could access funds. If you want to do a multi-country program, then you would need to come through an institution like the African Development Bank. But I do need to warn you at the outset, it's a long and complicated process to secure funds from the Green Climate Fund. There may be other bilateral sources that are quite specific. The German government, for example, runs the International Climate Initiative, IKI, and they give funds for these kinds of activities. And I'm not sure when their next call for proposals is. So there are places that you can look to get funds to support you in these kinds of activities.
Gareth, one of the important areas of your work is the gender-climate nexus. This interconnection was is, I should say, an important topic for the UPU. In fact, in March this year, in 2022, the UPU celebrated International Women's Day under the theme Sustainable Means Equal, which was highlighting the need for a greater gender balance in the industry to advance on its climate goals. So what's your take on this? How do you see the interdependence of these two goals across sectors?
We say when women succeed, we all succeed. Because we know that women are, they make up 50% of the workforce. They are extremely reliable. They have better records at repaying loans. When they make profit and money, they reinvest it in their household and in the community. And we lose a huge amount of women's resources through the fact that they're unable to access credit. They don't own land. They have child caring, childbearing, and housemaking responsibilities because of their gender, and so on. So, we very much realize that gender is an issue that needs to be addressed, and we mainstream it throughout all of our projects now in the bank to promote the role of women. In the climate environment, it's even more significant because so many women work in the agricultural sector, for example. When crops suffer, when rains fail, they don't get any income. When there's a drought, they're the ones who have to go and collect the water and spend more time walking further to do those kinds of things. And in the event of emergencies, it's often women who suffer the most. So women have a very hard time from climate change. And in my previous answer, I mentioned the Africa Climate Change Fund. The last call for proposals that we had was specifically to boost the role of women in climate change. And it's very important that that we do more in that area. So it's great that the Post has been recognising this and looking for opportunities to give a greater gender balance within the industry. And we really think it's important that as we move forward with climate change, we particularly recognise the role that women and girls can bring to tackling the problem.
Now, COP27 was recently held. What were your hopes and expectations going into COP27, and have they been met?
So, there's two levels. Obviously, we attend, as the African Development Bank, we attend the COP primarily as a sort of a fundraising activity to meet with our partners, to network, to explain the work that we're doing. It's a great event to meet and network. And I know a lot of people feel that it's a bit more of a talking shop, but for many of the sort of the non-negotiators that I say who attend, it is the best place to go on an annual basis to share ideas, to raise funds, to talk about the problems that we're facing and to address those. So, we had a very full program. We held a number of what we call side events. These are sort of 1 or 1.5 hour events where you present slides, talk about what you're doing, answer questions, and so on. And then you spend a lot of time walking around the corridors, meeting people, talking about things and making plans. So we had a very successful time. We raised the profile of a number of our funds. For example, the Africa Climate Change Fund. We had a couple of presentations about that to our investors and shareholders and stakeholders who've put money into those projects. And we also met with a number of high-level officials to kind of push Africa's need for finance. We met with donors from developed countries to explain, how we're using their money and how and why we need more. And that's very important because, they have to make difficult decisions about where to allocate funds. And it's a really good opportunity for us to advocate for support for Africa. On the bigger picture, of course, in the negotiations, then, these things move much more slowly. And I'm sure some of your listeners may have heard of, that the main outcome, I think, was on the creation of, or at least progress on loss and damage. That's an important development because we've been looking for progress on loss and damage for 20 years. It's been a thorn in the side of the negotiations for a long time. So good to see progress on that. But at the same time, we need to be realistic because it will take several years to create a fund. We then have to get money into it. We have to work out how to use it, who's going to be accredited to access it and what it's going to be used for and so on. So there's many more years of work ahead of us before we may actually see money coming for for loss and damage. But it's still, of course, we managed to hold on to the 1.5 degree target, which was good. There was a little bit of weakening around the language on the use of fossil fuels, I think was disappointing. And particularly we saw some further progress on what we call Article 6, which deals with how the private sector can engage in both mitigation and adaptation activities. And the adaptation side of that is an area that we are particularly focused on. So I was pleased with the progress that we made there.
Well, lastly then, Gareth, just sort of taking a bigger picture view, in your opinion, what are the most realistic and attainable climate goals, given these gaps in global socio-economic development?
I think in Africa, the major challenge that we have is access to energy. Energy changes people's lives, livelihoods, their lives, the way they live, their quality of life. If you put electricity into a house, you can have a refrigerator, lighting, a television, charge your phone for internet access and so on. So you improve their quality of life, but you also give people energy for productive use. So that means that you can use that energy to process agricultural produce, for example, and you can add value to it. You can store them for longer, which brings food security, and so on. So really, giving people access to energy is probably the single biggest thing that you can do to improve their quality of life and make them more climate resilient. Not far behind that is clean cooking technology, because every year, and I don't know the number, but thousands and thousands of women and girls die from inhaling fumes, smoke from their fire because they're working over a smoky fire and cooking in that. They suffer from asthma, chest infections, which make them more prone to other forms of respiratory disease. They waste so much time collecting firewood and so on. If you can replace that, even with a gas stove, and some people would argue not to use gas stoves because gas, of course, is a greenhouse gas and a fossil fuel. But even changing that with gas stoves or with bioethanol and so on to burn in the stove, it has a huge impact upon the quality of life for women and girls, which makes them much more resilient and contributes to society. So these are two of the big goals, I think, for Africa: energy access and clean cooking.
Gareth, this is a hugely important topic, not just for Africa, but for the entire world. And it's on the one hand encouraging to hear that people are taking it seriously, but it's also really sets out for us the amount of work that's yet to be done, not just in Africa, but around the world to mitigate against climate change or even try to avoid future global warming and other things like that. Gareth Phillips, Climate and Environment Finance Manager at the African Development Bank Group, thank you very much for joining us on the UPU Voicemail podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Voicemail, the official podcast of the Universal Postal Union. Subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcast platform and you'll get each episode downloaded to the device of your choosing as it's released. My thanks to the team at the UPU for their help putting together this episode. I'm your host, Ian Kerr, and I'll look forward to your company next time on Voicemail, the podcast of the UPU.